All right, I think we are ready to go. So, welcome everybody. Class number 6 out of 9. So, we are somehow almost finished, even though it feels like we are just scratching the surface. I think that's the fun part of studying a category as vast as modern Jewish thought. Just a little bit of review for last time. This is sort of going to be a continuation of last class. And so, I had promised that one class was probably going to take double, and we found it with Zionism. The 2-second summary just to catch everybody up in case people have missed previous classes is alongside the question of modernity, the biggest question or one of the biggest questions facing the Jewish community in the late 1800s, early 1900s was this question of how to achieve political equality or what they called emancipation. And we see Jewish thinkers running the full range of ideas and thoughts as to how Jews are finally going to break out of this medieval condition of being treated as secondary citizens. On the one hand, we had people whose ideas were Jews need more religious reform, and religious reform can go, in a multiplicity of directions, not necessarily the reform movement, but if only the religion of Judaism is reformed in ways that make it more palatable to a Western European mindset, then Jews will be treated equally, right? That was certainly the ideas that were pervasive in the early reform movement. Those were the ideas that were pervasive in the early pre-runner to the conservative movement, the ideas that were pervasive in modern orthodoxy. Other views, if only we can fix, say, underlying economic problems, then Jews will achieve political freedom, right? These are ideas that ended up forming what was known as the Jewish Bund, right? Jewish socialist and Marxist groups who very much signed on with Karl Marx's idea that all strife between humans is actually just rooted in something more fundamental, which is class struggle. And so if you ever sit there and wonder why in the late 1800s and early 1900s, so many Jews became Marxists and socialists and communists, it was because of this great promise of, if we only fix economic class structure and inequality, then anti-Semitism will sort of fall away as a byproduct. This was an enormously popular view among many Jews at the time. Other ideas, if we only usher in a brand of individualism and liberalism, then Jews will be treated equally. I think I had mentioned this last time, but this was the idea of Louis Brandeis, right? The first American Supreme Court justice wrote a book in, I think, 1917. Somebody can fact check me on the year, give or take a couple of years. But he writes a book essentially arguing that individualism and liberalism is what is going to cure anti-Semitism and solve anti-Semitism. Every single idea that I just went over, these ideas all assume that Jews are going to stay in whatever country they were living in as a minority, right? So it doesn't make a difference if you think that the Jewish problem is because of religion or economics or social politics, right? This is all assuming Jews are going to stay in France or Germany or America. We saw last week that, and of course this is, obvious to anybody who's paid attention in the last 120 years, but just to introduce the history, we saw last week a group of Jews starting to challenge this idea that if only we stay here meaning France, and here meaning Britain, and here meaning America, and here meaning Germany, if only we stay here long enough, things will increasingly get better. These Jews said, no, anti-Semitism is so pervasive and so dug into the roots of society that we actually need to create our own Jewish entity, right? We saw this with Theodor Herzl with his idea of political Zionism, and then we saw Ahad Ha'am later on saying, you're right, and also we need to save Judaism. So that was all of last week. Hopefully that was a good enough 4-minute summary for everybody to be caught up. Today I wanted to continue on the idea of Zionism, but I wanted to talk a little bit about anti-Zionism that arose in response to Theodor Herzl and his ilk. We already saw numerous times the Pittsburgh Platform in 1885, but just to go over it one more time, because this really is possibly one of the 5 most important Jewish historic documents of the 1800s, that the early reform movement, and by the 1880s it wasn't so early anymore, this is 60 years after early reform, was very threatened fundamentally by Zionism. And this is sort of for obvious reason if we understand the history behind it, right? The reform movement, both in Germany and then eventually in America, centering around the Midwest, so places like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and places there, their idea was the more that society progresses and the more that Judaism reforms, eventually these two things will just intersect and things will live happily ever after for Jews, right? And so throughout the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, the American reform movement, because at this time the reform movement switched its center from Germany to America as Jews continued to migrate from Western Europe to the Americas. The mainstream reform movement in America, again, they had felt that what Jews should be doing is staying in their countries, right? Say America in their case, and fighting for liberalism and progressivism, not spending all of their political and economic capital trying to build some nation state far away. And so we saw this here in 1885, and I had mentioned last time that this is about 10 or 15 years before Theodor Herzl ever wrote his book, The Jewish State. And so in a lot of ways, the reform movement is sort of guessing or they are premeditating this conversation that's eventually going to take place in the Jewish world. That's going to be all the rage between 1890 and World War I. I'll give a brief digression of what happens after World War I, but today we're going to focus really in that 30 or 40 years. I'll give the history and then we can go into the ideas, because I think the ideas are more interesting than the history. But the brief history, just to get us through the Holocaust, and then we'll go back and talk about the ideas, just in case people are confused what the legacy of a lot of these ideas were. After World War I, America closed its borders, or made it much harder to immigrate. This is in 1924. Between 1880 and 1924, just to give throw some statistics at you, I'll unshare my screen actually for a second. Between 1880 and 1924, so in that 40-ish years, about 2 to 3 million Jews come from mostly Eastern Europe, but also some Jews from Western Europe to the Americas, right? I'm going to guess if we took a poll here, the number of relatives of people in the Zoom call that came to America through Ellis Island through sometime between 1880s and 1924 due to mostly pogroms and violence against Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, I'm going to guess it would be at least 75% of people here have at least one grandparent, uncle, aunt that came through there. The vast majority of Ashkenazi American Jews come from there. Once America closes its borders, and after World War I, two things begin to happen. One, things begin to get worse for Jews in Europe, right? That much we know. And two, the sort of escape plan of Jews, which is, well, we can just go to America and try our luck there, that was off limits to Jews. And these two things were enough to convince the American Jewish community, again, at this point, which was mostly made up of Reform Jewish leaders from Germany, right? The same types who 40 years before were saying, we don't like Zionism, to start to say, we need to actually support Zionism because there are millions of Jews that are in trouble around the world and there's no escape plan for them, right? Once America closes its borders, right? European countries always had much stricter immigration laws than America. And so they began to say, well, we have no choice but to support a Jewish homeland. And so what ended up convincing most American Jews to become Zionists, and now basically every Jewish institution in America is Zionist, right? It doesn't matter if it's Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Secular, Reconstructionist, Jewish Federation, Hillel, right? We can go down the list. Most of it is not because of this Achad Ha'am or Herzl sort of idealism that in a vacuum, this is what Jews should have. It was really just out of necessity. It was, Jews are going to be in trouble and there's no one that will protect Jews. We need to support this project. Then, of course, everyone here knows this, but I just have to spell out the history or I'm not doing my job. By the time the Holocaust happens and World War II happens, and one, life for Jews, of course, gets much, much more disastrous, right? That's a huge understatement. And also immigration against Jews becomes even stricter during the Holocaust, and it becomes clear that countries around the world just do not care. There's a lot to say about that. There's a whole interesting legacy about America, and not only America, the American Jewish community during World War II. We can probably go down an entire rabbit hole of a class there in terms of, did the American Jewish community do enough to help Jews during the Holocaust, right? There's a couple questions implied in that. One is, how much did people actually know? Two is, how much could Jews have actually done? So we can, put those questions on the side. But by the time the Holocaust ended, this was essentially a closed case. So by the time you're getting 1940s, 1950s, and then, fast forward to now, the entire Jewish world, and I say entire, obviously there's, 5 to 10% who never came on board with Zionism, but the entire Jewish world essentially became de facto Zionists, if not outright supporters of Zionism. And once Israel was founded, this was celebrated across the Jewish world and over there. So that's the brief history. But I want to go back now because I think a very interesting chapter and something that's very telling about the history of the time is that period between the 1880s and World War I, this period where this was still an open question, is this a good idea? And we saw last time that, it's sort of hard not to have our hindsight 2020 seep in and say, well, of course this was a good idea. Didn't they know what was about to happen? The answer is no, they didn't, right? Nobody could have guessed what would have happened in Western Europe in the 20th century. All the signs on the wall, unless you were perhaps a very astute observer, is that things were getting better, right? All things equal, it was better to be a Jew in Germany or France in the year 1900 than the year 1800, right? By virtually every metric of well-being and equality and social status, right? It wasn't perfect in the 1900, but compared to 1800, when Jews still had not reached emancipation in Germany, right? The writing was on the wall to say, okay, in another 30 or 40 years, things will be better and better and better. And the job of the Jewish community is to stay here and ensure things are getting better and better and better. And so with that, we see our first thinker. This is in 1904, a writer named Lucien Wolff, who was a Jewish journalist, much like Herzl. He actually lived in Britain, unlike Herzl, who was obviously in Vienna at the time and then France. And so Lucien Wolff writes in 1904. Again, this is still very early on in the history of Zionism. This is a couple years after Herzl and Achad Ha'am and the early Zionists start to publish all of the material saying, Jews are only going to be safe in the homeland. And here is what Lucien Wolff writes in his book, The Zionist Peril. Think for a moment what we have done in these 100 years. Our legal emancipation has won in every civilized country in the world except Russia, Romania, and Turkey. And in those lands, we are refused our political rights only by virtue of a retrograde doctrine of nationality, which is itself one of the chief inspirations of Zionism. So he starts off with sort of a strong anti-nationalist attack, right? He says, in the last 100 years, everywhere that Jews have lived, right? He's, of course, talking about Europe. Jews have reached legal emancipation, right? Exactly what I said before. Things are better in 1904 than they were in 1804, right? We're doing good. And the countries where Jews are not treated equally, right? Russia, Turkey, right? The only reason why Jews don't have equality is because of nationalism, which is the exact goal of the Zionists. So he's pointing at the Zionists and he's saying, the thing you are trying to do is the chief thing that's actually blocking Jews from reaching emancipation here, right? Nationalism, right, is bad according to this reading because it's nationalism that divides people. He continues, he says, as for the alleged unreality and possible reversal of these emancipations, we may easily reassure ourselves. Broadly speaking, our victories were due not to any special tolerance or sympathy for the Jewish people, but to a revolution in the concept of nationality, which is fundamental to the modern constitution of society. Religious toleration and the acceptance of naturalization in lieu of the old doctrine of the indelibility of allegiance were the principles which govern Jewish emancipation. They establish a sort of economic brotherhood of man in place of the old theologico-racial classifications of nations, right? So he's saying this idea that people should be divided by race and religion, this idea is outdated. Again, there is a certain irony of him writing this in 1904, as these ideas obviously were bubbling. But you can imagine the sort of incentive for this type of argument. He's saying, we're ushering in a new time of what we might call constitutionalism, right? What's constitutionalism? It means that there is fundamental rights for everybody. It doesn't make a difference if the leader is Jewish, Christian, right, atheist, right? If there's a constitution and everybody's protected by the constitution, that is a check on power of what leaders can do. And so what he's saying is, hey, things are getting better. Let's not try to undo this. He then concludes his book. He says, to sum it up then, the characteristic parallel of Zionism is that it is the natural and abiding ally of anti-Semitism and its most powerful justification. So I hinted to this last week, but I wanted to show you this written in a relatively popular source in the 1900s. Why? Because he writes, it is an attempt to turn back the course of modern Jewish history, which hitherto, on its political side, has had for its main object to secure for the Jewish people an equal place with their fellow citizens of other creeds in the countries in which they dwell, and a common lot with them in the mainstream of human progress. It is essentially an ignorant and a narrow-minded view of a great problem. ignorant because it takes no account of the divisive or decisive element of progress in history, and narrow-minded because it confounds a political memory with a religious ideal. So he's saying three things here, and then we'll read the last paragraph and discuss for a second. One, this is something we said last time, but many anti-Zionists viewed Zionism as a natural alliance to anti-Semitism. Why? Because the anti-Semites were saying Jews should not mesh with society. The progressives, we'll call Lucy and Wolf a progressive, were saying, of course, Jews should mesh with society. And the Zionists were saying, no, they're right. Jews are not going to mesh with society. And so anti-Zionists had sort of a strong argument, which they were saying, until then, this sort of ideological battle in Western Europe was between Jews and anti-Semites, right? This is sort of obvious, right? The anti-Semites were saying Jews should not be treated equally, and the Jews were saying Jews should be treated equally. All of a sudden, with the advent of early Zionism, early Zionists weren't saying to the anti-Semites, yes, you're right, Jews shouldn't be treated equally, but they were saying to other Jews, hey, Jews are never going to be treated equally. So all of a sudden, within the Jewish community, you have two completely different conceptions of what Jewish history is going to be. One saying, things are getting better, we need to stay here and fight for our rights, anti-Semitism is on the decline, and another group that's saying, you guys are kidding yourself, anti-Semitism is not on the decline, even if it's temporarily on the decline, it's always there. And Lucian Wolff is saying, the Zionists are attempting to stop this sort of natural human progress, right? He's saying Zionism is ignorant because it takes no account of the decisive element of progress in history. In other words, if you are a progressive of a certain type in the early 1900s, your view of history is that things just get better, right? I don't think anybody has that view anymore, right? Regardless of whether or not you are a conservative or progressive or a Marxist or right? But in the early 1900s, this was a fairly rational view to have. I mean, you look at progress made in the last, couple decades, and things seem like they're getting better everywhere. Again, this is before even World War I and the economic collapse that brought. And so you're saying, a group of people that are attempting to set the clock back, right? Because essentially many of the Zionists were attempting to say, Jews need to reconnect with our ancient history, and exile was a mistake, and we need to sort of set the clocks back to the year zero, right? When Jews were in Jerusalem and we had a king and all of that. Obviously, they weren't advocating for a king, but that was the memory that they were putting forth in the Jewish consciousness. The Jewish progressives were saying, right, you're confounding a political memory with a religious ideal. In other words, right, the Jewish attachment to Israel, right? That's a political memory, right? It's not a religious ideal, right? And the Zionists are starting to talk about the two as if it's the same, right? That Zionism will cure all the problems of Judaism, right? That's what Herzl and Achad Ha'am and eventually Abraham Isaac Kook, who was the first religious Zionist, are teaching, right? He then says one more thing that I think is going to be very interesting for the second half of our conversation today, so I'll read it and we can discuss. He says, the temporal power of Judaism was a stage in the religious progress of the world, the product of conditions which have passed away forever. To try to repurpose it now would be like trying to breed fish in an exhausted watercourse. We have to show an example to the nations. We take our stand on the lofty toleration and real universalism of the Talmudic axiom that the pious of all the nations have their place in the world to come. Our highest traditional ideal is undoubtedly national, but it is not the nation of a kept principality, but the holy kingdom of a nation of priests. Having given to the world the fundamental laws which have made the most advanced races what they are, we have to complete the work in our providential dispersion by leading the way in the most fruitful application of these laws. That is the real Jewish nationalism, the only true Zion. So unshare my screen for a second and we can discuss this, because this is going to nicely summarize the mainstream, I'm going to say a bunch of adjectives and then I'll unpack it, the mainstream non-Orthodox anti-Zionist approach of the pre-Israel period was this exact line of reasoning, right? It wasn't the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism. The ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism is something else entirely. It was, we have to wait until God brings us back to the promised land, right? We can potentially get into that a little bit, right? The non-Orthodox, right, Lucian Wolff could be thought of as, on the spectrum of, Reform Judaism, right? He had certain ideas about Judaism that he thought constituted its makeup. He said, Judaism has an ideal. Our ideal, in his case, is a universalism which betters the world, right? An idea that seems, relatively uncontroversial. He said, what better way to ruin your universalism if all the Jews go to this one place? In other words, if you think you have a job to do, right? If there's 25 people in this class right now, and you think you have a mission to make sure that all 25 people in this class understand a certain concept, and the first thing you do is take 3 friends and go to a separate Zoom, right? That is the opposite of your mission. And so many of the early anti-Zionists are sort of shouting from the rooftop, the conception of Judaism that the Zionists are pushing forward is not a quote unquote ideal conception of Judaism. They're trying to go backwards. They're trying to go to an outdated political structure and ideal, whereas we are ushering in the true Jewish ideal, right? What Lucien Wolff calls the real Zion, right? The real Zion is when the entire world becomes perfected through these ideas, not just Jews in one small strip of land. So I'll take a pause for a second, then we'll see 2 or 3 other sources that sort of carry this reasoning a little further. But any thoughts or questions until then? Okay, perfect. So oh, go for it, Rhea. Sorry, didn't see the hand.
Oh no, sorry. So as you're talking, it brings up the cabal kind of undercurrent politically here now, that it's the Jews. It's a worldwide plot, and the internationalism is that it's world control, and this is sort of a precursor to the anti-Semitic trope of the internationalism of Jews. It's what do you call it? Um, it's unintentioned link.
Yeah. The irony, and Jewish history, if nothing else, is filled with ironies, is that both the Zionists and anti-Zionists are going to end up reflecting anti-Semitic tropes, not because either of them were anti-Semitic, but because anti-Semitism ended up taking both sides of this debate. And in other words, right, and this is still true today, right? Anti-Semites will both paint Jews exactly as you said, as a sort of wandering globalist, universalist. They have no home. They're just sort of, all they care, they're trying to tear down borders and they're trying to allow untempered immigration because the Jews are sort of homeless. And then at the same time, chauvinist nationalists, hardcore capitalists, right? And so, both sides of this argument are going to, both win and lose, right? And it's very easy to hold up a mirror and say, hey, your side's reflecting anti-Semitism. But this was, of course, the exact problem that Jews were trying to figure out, sort of in real time. This is right around the time that, of course, Protocols of Elders of Zion was published. Protocols of Elders of Zion was, sort of interesting because this was, of course, an alleged Jewish conspiracy theory to take over the world, but also they used the idea Elders of Zion, right? The Protocols of Elders of Zion was based off of the Zionist Congress. And so you sort of have this, dipping into both sides. And this was a very serious question for Jews, right? Which side do you go on, right? Where is the Jewish future going to lie? Is it in this, universalism of Lucien Wolff with liberalism and progressivism and maybe Marxism if you're a Bundist, or was it in particularism and nationalism? And of course, it doesn't need to be a binary, right? There were thinkers, right, such as Achad Ha'am, or later on we'll see Martin Buber, who were Zionists but also universalists, right? So it's not you either choose, you care about humanity or you're a Zionist, right? I don't want to paint that. But in terms of broad strokes, if you're saying, what is the wider Jewish mission, right? This is where these debates were really coming to the forefront. Just to go see, sort of the same generation, right? Hermann Cohen, who was a very well-renowned philosopher, both in the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community. He was also very much the teacher of people like Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, and by extension even Joseph Soloveitchik, who ended up being the leader of American modern orthodoxy. So he talks quite a bit about this idea of messianism, right? And this is where I wanted to have our main crux of the conversation today, which is this idea of Zionism and messianism. Because, and just to unpack this a little bit, at the time, right, the traditional Jewish view. So let's take a step back. If you go back to the year 1700, anybody in the Jewish world connected returning to the land of Israel with Messianism, right? That much was clear. Many early Zionists, such as Theodor Herzl, right, first generation secular religious Zionists, sort of gave up on messianism, right? And they even wrote as much, right? So if you ask Theodor Herzl, are you giving up on the idea of the Messiah coming? Theodor Herzl would say yes, right? This is sort of an outdated idea. Jews need to sort of, redeem ourselves. We can't wait for the Messiah. And so many anti-Zionists, and this is true both in the ultra-Orthodox world and in the non-Orthodox world, sort of attacked Zionists. And they were saying, Zionism is sort of giving up on all the idealism of Judaism, right? Judaism has an ideal that of universalism, and this is true if you're ultra-Orthodox, and this is true if you're Reform, that there are some, messianic ideal of Judaism, and the Zionists seem to just be completely dropping this idea. The Zionists seem to be saying, this great project of Judaism over the last 2,000 years, right, all of a sudden it's gone, right? In one generation, the Zionists, right, and this is, of course, if you were Theodor Herzl, your response would be, yes, you're right, right? This is exactly what Herzl wrote, right? Herzl said his goal of Zionism was actually so Jews can just become like any other nation, right? The flip side of becoming like any other nation is you're no longer special, right? And so many anti-Zionists, pointed this out. And Hermann Cohen was one of the first ones to do this. He's writing also in the early 1900s, and he is defending this conception of universal messianism against early Zionists. So we can read and then discuss. He says, we interpret our entire history as pointing to this messianic goal, right? This is going to be an important sentence because what Hermann Cohen is saying is that the entirety of Jewish history, at least according to his view, is about perfecting the world, right? An idea that I think lands well to many people who understand the idea of tikkun olam to be the most common said phrase in Jewish community. He says, all our prophets have us living among the nations and all view Israel's remnants from the perspective of its world mission. This politico-religious orientation of ours, for all practical purposes, the difference between us and Zionism. While the Zionist believes that Judaism can be preserved only by an all-encompassing Jewish nationalism, we are of the opposite view, believing that only a universal mankind-oriented Judaism can preserve the Jewish religion. And so he's directly attacking, not even really Theodor Herzl, but people like Echad Ha'am, right? If you remember Echad Ha'am specifically said, we need a cultural center to preserve Judaism, right? Judaism cannot prosper and bloom freely if it's in the diaspora, right? Judaism needs a cultural center to breathe life into the diaspora. Hermann Cohen is saying, no, it's the exact opposite, right? The entire purpose of Judaism, and this is actually very similar, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, to Moses Mendelssohn, who starts writing about Jeremiah and Jews' missions among the nations, right? This idea of plant vineyards and get married, where Hermann Cohen is saying, the point of Judaism is to be dispersed, right? Is to be scattered, right? This idea is going to, obviously end up being quite controversial later on. This idea also, I'll add, probably one of the biggest implicit tensions in 2025 between American Jews and Israeli Jews, regardless of whether or not one is Zionist or not. But your average Israeli does not understand why all Jews living anywhere is not immediately right now picking up and moving to Israel, right? I would guess 9 out of 10 Israeli Jews are just shocked that there are still Jews living in places like Orange County, right? Whether they're right or wrong, right? That's a separate conversation. I'm going to guess by dint of everyone here still remaining in Orange County and other places, you think that they're wrong, as do I. But Jews in the diaspora always said, no, you don't need to be living in the land of Israel to practice some Jewish ideal, right? That Judaism has always had a diasporic center, right? And there's good historic arguments for this, right? Even during the time of the temple, there were many Jews living in Babylonia, and right, we can sort of go down the list. Hermann Cohen is clearly on the diasporist side, right? He is what we might call a diasporic nationalist, right? That Judaism should remain in the diaspora and should work to bettering whatever nation state Jews happen to be living in. For him, in the early 1900s, it was Germany. And so for the next 90 seconds, erase any memory of World War II from your head and try to understand this in its historic context. I know that's a very lofty and hard thing to do. But Hermann Cohen's going to go on to write, he says, we love Germany and all that it stands for, not merely because we love our homeland as the bird loves its nest, right? So he's saying, we love Germany, right? Jews, right? Progressive Jews in Germany. And it's not just because it's our homeland, right? He's saying, but mainly because of our awareness of that innermost accord existing between the German spirit and our messianic religiosity. Their German spirit is the spirit of classical humanism and true universalism. Therefore, it is only natural that we German Jews should feel at one with ourselves as Jews and German. And the Jews of other countries whose religious life has been fructified by the science of Judaism, which has its roots in Germany, should learn to acknowledge and appreciate Germany's central significance for moral culture. So what is Hermann Cohen saying? Again, forget any memory of World War II in your head. He's saying, hey, you in the late 1800s, early 1900s, by this time it's already early 1900s, right? You seem to appreciate, physics and math and medicine and Kantian philosophy, right? We talked about Kant before. Hermann Cohen was a neo-Kantian, right? Everybody seems to appreciate all of these ideas, right? These ideas happen to come from this place called Germany, right? It just so happened that a lot of the people who helped spread these ideas were Jews living in Germany. We could talk about Karl Marx, we could talk about other people, right? Maybe not even Germany-centric, Emil Durkheim, right? Sigmund Freud, right? All of these great Jewish thinkers that are coming from the diaspora. And he's saying, not just is Germany our homeland, but Germany is actually a place that could become the messianic ideal, right? What closer matches the sort of messianic ideal of prophets like Amos and Isaiah, right, where the lion will lay with the lamb, or the wolf will lay with the lamb, and there will be world peace, and nations will come together and beat your swords into plowshares, right? Then a progressive country that treats everybody the same, right? This is quite a radical idea for Europe in the early 1900s, of this idea of just equality, right? It doesn't matter what your religion or race or background is, you are treated equal just by dint of you being a human, right? For Hermann Cohen, right, this is the messianic ideal, right? This is what Judaism has been waiting for thousands of years. This is, right, I'll add, because he writes this, I just didn't put the quote. He says this is the idea that Judaism came up with, right, in the idea that all humans are created in the image of God. He says, that the natural spirit that exists between Jewish theology and Western European liberalism / progressivism of equality mixed with the Jewish spirit of messianism, right? What is messianism but actually living up to the ideals of Jewish theology? In other words, treating everyone the same and equally, and there's no more war and no more strife, right? For Hermann Cohen, it's obvious that this is the right direction of Judaism. Now you have early Zionists that are running around telling everybody, no, the real Jewish ideal and what Jews need to do is everybody leave here, right? Let's get all of the best Jewish thinkers, all of the best Jewish scientists, all of the Jewish capital in places like, say England, where, there were some very wealthy Jews, such as the Rothschilds, and everybody start to move your money to, what was then part of the Ottoman Empire. Again, this is before World War I. And this is not a place that has a lot of influence on the world stage, right? Nobody would look to the Ottoman Empire in the year 1904 for, which direction is physics moving, right? Nobody's asking to visit the Ottoman Empire. And so Hermann Cohen is saying, if Judaism goes the route of Zionists, this is essentially a complete giving up of the mission of Judaism, right? It's a complete giving up of messianism. And so, right, forgetting what ends up happening, right? You can imagine this idea very much striking hard in the spirit of the Jewish community. It did a lot to actually convince. Again, it's still at this time the Zionists were still the fringe minority, right? They were definitely gaining support, but until World War I, the majority of Jews living in Europe were not Zionists, right? And many of the early aliyahs, right, of moving to Israel were actually made up of Eastern European Jews, because in Eastern Europe, there wasn't this equality, right? Nobody would have spoken about Russia, after all the pogroms that happened late 1800s, early 1900s, as Jews need to stay and just love Russia a little bit more. But the sort of irony of Jewish history is, if you had to pick one country outside of the United States to be born in as a Jew in 1904, assuming you weren't going to stay there for very long, right, it probably should be Germany, right? Germany was the best place to be Jewish outside of the United States in the early 1900s. And this very much points to what Hermann Cohen is saying is, you, the Zionists, you're willing to give up on all that, right? Not only are you willing to give up on all that, you're actually giving fodder to the anti-Semites who are saying, no, 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 this isn't actually real. This isn't going to happen. The Jews are always a separate group. They're a state within a state. They don't actually care about Germany, right? All of those arguments that the anti-Semites had spent 100 years arguing as to why Jews should not receive equality, Hermann Cohen is now seeing in the Zionists, right? We'll do one or two more sources, and we'll discuss for a little bit. Then I have one final source, right? One of the, most widely read Jewish thinkers of the pre-Holocaust era in Western Europe was Franz Rosenzweig. Next week, when we are actually caught up on our classes, we'll talk a little bit more about his Jewish philosophy. He has a fascinating Jewish history. At one point, he had renounced his Judaism and, potentially became Christian. Then he later on discovered his Judaism and, came back to it and wrote this book called the Star of Redemption. But in it, he puts forth this vision of what Jews should be, and it is as follows. He says, the true eternity of the eternal people must always be alien and vexing to the state and to the history of the world. In the epochs of world history, the state wields its sharp sword and carves hours of eternity in the bark of the growing tree of life, while the eternal people, untroubled and untouched year after year, adds ring upon ring to the stem of its eternal life. So this is a very powerful quote, and I'll unshare my screen and we can unpack this for a little bit and discuss for a second what Rosenzweig is putting forth, which is what became an enormously popular idea, again, obviously connected to ideas that Lucien Wolff and Hermann Cohen started to bring forward. But Rosenzweig sort of goes to the, takes it to the logical conclusion, which is he begins to refer to Jews and Judaism as the eternal people, right? What does the eternal people mean? For Rosenzweig, it means untouched by any of the, shall we call it, banality of statehood and politics and bureaucracy and corruption, right? This argument would go as follows. In any institution, especially a governmental or political institution, it doesn't matter, from this perspective, if it's right-wing or left-wing or religious or secular, anytime you have power, it's going to be corrupting, right? Especially once you have political and bureaucratic power. And if it's not corrupting, bad things are still going to happen as a byproduct, right? Once you have a nation, then you need laws, then you need people to enforce the laws, then you need weapons, then there's going to be violence, right? Anytime you have any civilization, right, that's a sort of a natural outgrowth. For Franz Rosenzweig, the uniqueness of Jews and the Jewish people is this image of wandering. And, as Rhea said before, wandering has been used by anti-Semites to not give Jews a place in society, but it's also been used by Jews to sort of argue about the uniqueness of the Jewish mission, right? From this perspective, the uniqueness of the Jewish mission is that Jews are sort of, the same way in the Bible, you had a class of people who were not given any land, right? The Levites famously were not given any land, and they were specifically supposed to be the people who wandered around from town to town and city to city, bringing, messages of godliness and justice, and many of the prophets come from this tribe, and so the importance of somebody like Samuel, who was a traveling judge and prophet, is specifically that he had no city, right? He was always going around bringing some message, and Rosenzweig is saying, well, this is essentially the Jewish people, right? If you force Samuel the prophet, or you force all the Jews to live in a certain area, right, then how are they going to fulfill their universal mission of going from place to place? So therefore, any alignment with a national project, according to Rosenzweig, is going to be antithetical to Judaism. It doesn't mean you shouldn't live somewhere, by the way. He's not, advocating, okay, go live in a desert somewhere and renounce all belongings, because, of course, for this philosophy to work, you have to be intertwined within whatever society you lived in. So he's not advocating a retreat from the public sphere. If anything, he would say what Jews should be doing is diving in more to whatever country they're in, join activist groups, join politics, join government, but always keep a little bit of distance, understanding that the true ideal of the Jewish mission can never be adequately represented in something man-made and bureaucratic. This is, on the one hand, a incredible, very interesting view of the unique destiny of the Jewish people. It's also, right, as it was knocked by, adversaries, sort of so impractical as to render, the Jewish people so unique as to say, okay, but like Jews still have to go to work and make money and, protect themselves and all of that. So you can sort of imagine this debate playing out. And we'll see in a second. Our last thinker for today will read a rebuttal to Rosenzweig by Martin Buber, who was one of his close intellectual friends slash rivals, we'll call it. But before we do that, any thoughts or questions on Rosenzweig's idea?
Can you hear me? Rabbi Daniel, could I ask a question?
Please.
Sorry, let me turn my camera on. I have a question for you. There's this maybe an extreme fear that one day Jews will get expelled from all the countries and like have to return to Israel. Do you think that's like a possibility that one day, like the same way a place had like a Jewish ghetto, like now the whole world will have a Jewish ghetto and it'll be the Jewish nation? Do you think that's a possibility?
I think so. I think just to make sure I'm getting your question correctly. Sorry, can you ask it one more time?
Sure. So, kind of, there's this fear that Jews are going to be expelled from various countries. It's like, oh, this Zionist influence, or whatever the reason is. Like, if all Jews had to return to Israel, could that become like a ghetto of sorts? Like the same way in Italy, they have like the Jewish section. Like the world will have a Jewish section where, hey, we don't want them getting out and causing trouble, and we're going to restrict Israeli travelers. We don't know if they're extremists, and like for some reason, would be like ghettoized in Israel.
Yeah, I mean that. Yes, 100%. Meaning, from Rosenzweig and Hermann Cohen and Lucien's Wolf perspective, what Jews were doing was essentially advocating for a ghetto, right? Exactly what you're saying. They're saying
Yeah.
our goal is assimilation, like, not in the bad way assimilation, but integration, we'll call it. And the Zionist goal is ghettoization, right? They are trying to tell, oh, all the Jews go live here because you're not safe anywhere else. So 100%, right? This is Lucien's Wolf point. This is why he was so adamant against, what he wrote as the Zionist peril, because he's saying, even if the Zionists succeed, right? And, he wasn't saying this project, there's no chance of this working. He's saying, if the Zionists succeed, what is this going to do for Jews? Say, let's pick Italy because that's what you use. Jews living in Italy, your fellow Italians are going to say, "Oh, so you're not actually Italian. You're
Mhm.
you're part of this Jewish nation, and you're a Zionist, and so." Why should we give you equal rights? So, but this is what Jews were fighting against, sort of on all sides. And so, yeah, great question. I hope that answered it correctly.
Yes. Thank you.
Rhea, go for it.
Okay, so this is in addition to what you had were talking about, that the evangelical Christians, that this is the concept of Armageddon, when all the Jews gather in Israel, one place, and Armageddon occurs, and then all the righteous or the true believers will rise up to heaven. And so we say that the evangelical support of Israel has a caveat, and that's the caveat.
Yeah, I mean, and this is again the sort of natural ally. I mean, this is why it ends up being so tense and such an interesting historic debate. Again, whether or not we still value the anti-Zionist criticism in 2025, right? That's sort of for you to decide at home. But at least in terms of the historical analysis, it was a lot of the, for lack of a better term, right? Not just, fundamentalist Christians, right? It was a lot of also hardcore nationalists, but certainly there were Christian voices in Germany, right? Who were saying to the Jews, right? Judaism should not be treated on equal footing to Christianity. And so many of them had, but they still, in some sense, the line between, anti-Semite and philo-Semite, right? Hating Jews and loving Jews, not that they're the same, but anytime you look at a specific population and you say, wow, you are so unique for A, B, C, D, and E reasons, right? It's very easy to see how one could eventually dip into the other. Many of the Zionists, right, their goal was just, at least Theodor Herzl and his sort of political Zionists, all they wanted is to be treated equally, right? So Herzl just said, give us our own state so we don't have to worry at all. Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who was a 20th century Jewish thinker, and he was a very widely renowned thinker in Israel. He sort of wrote, for me, Zionism is nothing less and nothing more than being fed up by being ruled by non-Jews, right? So he sort of just said this flat out, right? He said, I don't attribute any religious or any social justice values or any, he's like, the state has no religious value to me, right? And he actually said this as a religious Jew. It's very interesting. He lived his life as a fully halachically observant Jew. But he said, for me, this is just, I want to make sure at the end of the day that if I call 911 and the paramedics come, they're not going to be anti-Semitic, right? So that was sort of his idea of what Zionism meant. But for other people, you're 100% right. If you're urging all the Jews to end up going to the land to Israel because that will, cause some end of days apocalypse, on the one hand, you're sort of natural allies with the Zionists. On the other hand, you're natural enemies to the Jews, right? I'll give you an even more controversial example. This was a very short-lived project. And I will, I usually don't give my opinion. I will defend why they did this in case anybody wants to discuss in 10 minutes after class ends. But early on, I think until 1937, somebody cannot easily fact check the year, there were Zionists that were collaborating with Nazis as a part of a eventual push to get all the Jews lifted from Germany and move them to, at that time, British Mandate Palestine. And from the Zionist perspective, they were saying, well, we think something much worse is going to happen, right? We want Jews to go to Palestine. They clearly don't want Jews there, right? The best situation for everybody would be all those Jews to end up leaving Germany and going to Palestine. But it meant that there were Zionists who were willing to collaborate with, even plans to ethnically cleanse Jews. Now, one could say, well, they should have been fighting against the Nazis and everything, maybe they should have, but, Zionists always had a way of being, ruggedly pragmatic, right? We'll call it that, right? And Herzl's whole point was we have to be pragmatic. What's interesting about all the sources we just read, Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, Lucien Wolf, they're all very not pragmatic, right? And again, there's always, a role, you never want to be 100% pragmatic, but you also have to be a little bit pragmatic in life, right? And so many of the anti-Zionists were wildly non-pragmatic, right? At least this is how many people attack them. And we'll see Martin Buber sort of attack on Rosenzweig in a second, where they're saying, you're talking about these nice, lofty ideals that have no bearing on material reality, right? I can sit here all day and say, you know what, it would actually be best for everybody here if you renounced all material belongings and you quit your job and you wandered in a forest, becoming enlightened, and you went from town to town, visiting the sick and providing comfort for people who live on the streets. That's a great ideal. Perhaps you might even say, yeah, that would be great. That's wildly unpragmatic, right? You have, rent to pay or mortgages to pay and, jobs and families and a city and commitments. And so in some sense, you can also imagine this debate taking place on this plane. Now, the anti-Zionists, what they would say, right, in defense, is they would say, well, the whole point of a religious ideal is to not be pragmatic, right? If it's just about pragmatism, then where does religion fit in? I can become pragmatic myself, right? The whole point of a theology or religious teaching is to inspire me to do something that I wouldn't ordinarily do in the, banality of day-to-day life, right? It's to inspire me to, the whole idea, let's just pick a very easy one, right? Like charity is unpragmatic, right? If somebody works hard for their money, right? It's not, it's an ideal to say, I'm going to give away a certain percent of that. Yet virtually all religions, right, certainly Judaism would say, yes, that's what you're supposed to do, right, is not view life towards, just pragmatism and what's going to be best. So in some sense, this meta debate is taking place across these two sides. Let's see Martin Buber, and then we can get one or two more questions, just because Martin Buber, I think, nicely adds his voice to this and very much takes the other side of this, and he's writing, right directly in response to a Rosenzweig here. And this is a very, tongue-in-cheek answer. And we'll spend more time with Buber next week, because Martin Buber, along with Franz Rosenzweig, are probably two of the most important pre-Holocaust Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. And so he's sort of hitting back at this idea that Zionism is a giving up on Judaism. And so he says, Zionism opposes not the messianic idea, but rather the misrepresentation and distortion of this idea found in a considerable part of liberal Jewish anti-Zionist literature. This misrepresentation and distortion glorifies in the name of messianism the dispersion, debasement, and homelessness of the Jewish people as something unconditionally valuable and fortunate, as something that must be preserved because it prepares humanity for the messianic age, right? So everything we discussed before, he's saying Zionism isn't against the idea of messianism, but Zionism is against this sort of, idea that there's something valuable and to be glorified about homelessness, right? That homelessness is ipso facto a virtue, right? Isn't it great that we, in the equivalent of renouncing your possessions, right? You could look at somebody who has no job and no house and just wanders around. One perspective is, wow, so amazing. This person is totally free. This person has no belongings or commitments that tie him down. And Martin Buber is saying, this isn't unconditionally valuable, right? Why are we glorifying this, position of homelessness? So he says as follows. He says, Zionism too sees the goal of Judaism as the redemption of the human spirit and the salvation of the world, right? So he says, we're not giving up on this idea of messianism, right? We're keeping to it. But we see as the means to the realization of this goal, the liberation of a tormented people and its gathering around God's sanctuary, right? So he's saying, right, it's not just that we'll have a, sorry, give me 1 second. Sorry about that. So Zionism sees Judaism, yes, as with the same messianic ideal as everybody else, but he's saying, first, before we reach this goal, right, we have to liberate a tormented people, right? It's very hard to have a Jewish version, right? I'll put it this way. It's very hard to have Jewish messianism if there are no more Jews left, right? This is what Martin Buber is saying. So he says, in the messianic age, let Jewry merge with mankind. But let us make sure that the Jewish people does not disappear now, so that the messianic age may perhaps come into being later. The Jewish people must persevere in the midst of today's human order, not as a fixed, brittle fact of nature appended to an ever more diluted confessional religion, right? This is one of my favorite lines in modern Jewish thought, but as a people pursuing its ideal freely and unhindered for the sake of the human order. So he's saying, Judaism that exists now, right, in the diaspora is a brittle, right, diluted confessional religion. What does he mean by that? He's saying, you're making Judaism all about theology and all about ideas, but it's diluted, right? Most Jews don't actually take these ideas too seriously. And Judaism, right, he's writing, in Germany in the early 1900s, but easily the same argument could be made for many American Jewish communities in 2025. He's saying, Judaism is becoming a small part of people's lives, a diluted religion that's starting to lose a lot of power of conviction over people. And so Jewish people have to exist as a people pursuing its ideal freely and unhindered for the sake of human order, right? This is sort of Achad Ha'am, right, writing about cultural Zionism. But what Martin Buber is importantly saying is this is not a giving up on the universalism of Judaism. This is saying Jews still need to be around to actually eventually help bring this universalism into context. So he goes as follows. He says, the struggle for a homeland is a national struggle. The struggle for Jewish communal existence in Palestine will be a supranational one, right? This is an important line we'll unpack in a second. We want Palestine not for the Jews. We want it for mankind because we want it for the realization of Judaism, right? So he flips the argument on his head. Just to unpack this last couple of sentences, he says, yes, in the short term, the struggle for a homeland, Zionism, is a national struggle, right? It just pertains to Jews. But the struggle for keeping Jews alive and Judaism alive, in other words, communal existence, is not just a national one, it's an international, or what he calls supranational one. He says, we want Palestine, not for the Jews, but we want it for mankind because we want to be able to realize Judaism for it. So Buber claps back at the end. I'll just summarize this and we can discuss in a second, of not going the route of Herzl and not going the route of the anti-Zionists, right? Herzl said, yes, you're right. We're giving up on messianism, right? We have no more ideals, right? Judaism's not about ideals. Judaism's about me making sure that I live till tomorrow, right? That was, an overgeneralization of Herzl's ideas. The anti-Zionists were saying Jews have kept around these ideals for thousands of years and we're about to flush it down the toilet and give up on all the progress we've made, not just in the last 2,000 years, but in the last 100 years. And Judaism should try to continue its goal in its And the best way to further the Jewish goal is to remain scattered around the nations and in diaspora and in community with a whole diverse range of people. Buber saying, okay, but we still need to make sure at the end of the day that Jews are still around and Judaism's still around. And Judaism in Germany, right? Forget even the physical danger that Jews are in. Judaism's in danger, right? Look at how many Jews are going to synagogue on Shabbat in Germany in early 1900s. I can bet you it was not that much, right? You have all sorts of Jewish writers complaining about Western European involvement in Jewish community in the late 1800s and early 1900s, right? And so Buber's saying, okay, if Judaism is this great thing, which he would agree on, and Messianism is this great thing, right? This universal ideal of Judaism is great. Okay, amazing. But if the Jewish people are the people who take these ideas from one generation to another, it would be sort of a shame if these people just assimilated into oblivion. So at the end of the day, we still need a place that will keep these ideas fostering, right? Both Jew safe and Judaism prospering, right? Both Herzl and Ahad Ha'am's ideas of Zionism that we discussed last week. And so he's sort of clapping back and saying, the goal of Israel, in one sense, is to protect Jews and Judaism. In a second sense, right, and this is an idea that sort of very much made it into the mainstream and Jewish community, but I think Buber was the first one to spell this out, at least in relationship to Zionism. The goal of the state of Israel on the global stage is to be an or lagoyim, right, a light unto the nations. And it's Israel that Martin Buber is sort of shouting from the rooftops that, let's say, some terrible earthquake happens in Haiti, right? The messianic universalist ideals of Judaism say Israel should spend its own taxpayer money to send a field hospital to Haiti and almost always be the first country there and make sure that people there are fine, right? That's the Jewish value. It doesn't help much if there's, a couple of Jews sitting in Berlin intellectually saying, well, it might be nice to send help here, but we actually have no power, so there's nothing we can do, right? Buber is arguing for universalism through particularism, as opposed to universalism in and of itself. I'll give one more way to understand this debate, and then we can take any and all thoughts, right? This question is sort of still around today in intellectual circles. Is power ipso facto bad, right? Is there something about power that's always negative? And it seems that many of the anti-Zionists in the 1900s, right? Again, I always have to be clear. These are not, not the same thing as an anti-Zionist in 2010. But many of the early 20th century anti-Zionists were essentially giving a version of, yes, power is always going to be corrupting in some way. And if we want Judaism to maintain its sort of, ideal mission, right, it can't be muddied by power. Martin Buber is saying the exact opposite, right? Martin Buber is saying, if you have no power, you have no ability to be creative, and you have no ability to have any muscle behind your ideas, right? It's all well and good if I sit here and say, I want to, feed anyone who's hungry in Orange County, I want to feed, but if I have no money, right, that's just an idea. And what Martin Buber is saying is the best way to be able to fulfill these ideas is to actually go out and amass power. So then you could actually carry out these ideas. So it's a fascinating debate, not just about, sort of the Jewish future and where Jews should be moving. It pertains Judaism, it pertains the Jewish ideal / messianism, it pertains these debates about power that I think we're sort of still having today. Now, there's obviously a lot more to say about sort of the legacy of these debates, but this was, where Western European Jews were sort of, ended up pivoting into thinking, right? This is now the 1900s, right? So all of a sudden debates between, Reform and conservative and Orthodox were sort of on the decline. And this was all the rage. So if you visited, Berlin or Paris or even New York in the early 1900s, right, this would have been the sort of, debates on the front page of Jewish newspapers. And, you would have gone to book talks and you would have heard, different people talking in synagogue or, whatever equivalent about these ideas. Happy to take any and all questions. We still do have a few more weeks, so we'll get to see at least some of these ideas as they naturally evolve. But thank you, everybody, for coming. I know some people have to leave at 10:30, but if you don't, I am here and excited to talk if anyone wants to
I have a
keep chatting.
question, Rabbi.
Yeah, go for it.
Something that kind of emerges over the last couple of years when you look at Zionism. You see, many people are now claiming that Zionism is just an extension of Western imperialism, colonialism. when it comes to that we just took the land no different than the British did with their expansion and all that, that we're just part of this colonial empire. Did anyone see it at that time that it just was a colonial expansion?
No one really in the Jewish community saw it that way. Again, it's always it's always one of these interesting things. I'll say a couple of facts that seem to contradict each other, but they're sort of all true. Fact one, colonialism was not seen as a bad thing until very recently. And so nobody would have, right, the sort of knee-jerk reaction to colonialism is that's bad, right? That did not exist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was actually considered a good thing, right? Advanced nations, colonized, right? Unadvanced nations were not able to colonize, right? So that's one. Two, because many of the early Zionists were operating from a Western European milieu and political condition in which colonialism was a good thing, many of them used the language of colonialism, right? So, this is always confusing to people. If you read even Theodor Herzl, he talks about the colonization of Palestine and everything there, but the connotation is not the same as when, say, the British did it and the French did it. And the most obvious reason, and I'm sure everyone here knows this, but just to spell it out, is there was no motherland. I mean, this was sort of, the paradox of Zionism is that early Zionists spoke the language of that you hear from, indigenous groups about diaspora and homeland and exile and return, right? But because of their historic condition, they're using the language, and oftentimes, some of the tactics of Western European colonialism. So, it's sort of both there. Nobody at that time would have, pointed to Zionism and said, this is colonialism, this is bad. That didn't happen until the Soviet Union and really until the 60s and 70s. And, there's a lot to say about this, but the Soviet Union was, interestingly enough, one of Israel's big allies in, 1948. Russia or the Soviet Union was probably closer allied to Israel than actually America in 1948. Once Israel, became clear that Israel was not going to be the sort of communist beacon in the Middle East, and once other Arab countries, most notably Egypt, begin to adopt, a sort of neo-Marxism or socialism as their public platform, the Soviet Union completely switches. America, obviously, backs Israel a lot heavier. And then you start to get a lot of this, very virulent anti-Zionist propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union. And that's when you get the Zionism is racism, and Zionism is Nazism, and Zionism is colonialism in a bad way. So these ideas sort of don't really connect. But of course, today people are sort of endlessly confused. So they'll open up a quote from, Herzl, and he'll say, the colonization of Palestine, but it's not really what he meant. I hope that.
Yeah, I know it's like within the Jewish lots of the Jews who are anti-Zionist or maybe not as pro-Israel will use it as the excuse of that Israel is this, colonial imperialistic capitalistic state that doesn't belong there.
Yeah, so that was all we could thank the Soviet Union for those ideas. I mean, not 99% of those ideas just came straight from the Soviet Union, as sort of an explicit way to challenge, Zionism, and there's sort of a lot to say there. But this is sort of very detached from these ideas happening in the 1800s and 1900s. Now, nationalism was sort of the big debate point. So it wasn't so much that there were Jews saying this is colonialism, colonialism's bad. There was a debate in the Jewish community about nationalism. Is nationalism good or bad, right? And there were clearly some Jews who thought nationalism was bad, right? Many of the anti-Zionists in the early 1900s thought any type of nationalism is bad. Why are we trying to add more nationalism? We should want more globalism, right? And this is, groups like the Bund and like many of the anti-Zionist critics that we saw. But they weren't really saying it's bad because of colonialism. And they also weren't saying that Zionism was uniquely bad. I mean, one of the interesting things you get today is that among anti-Zionists, they will say that Israel and Zionism is uniquely bad and uniquely evil, right? The anti-Zionists in the late 1800s and early 1900s, right? Their anti-Zionism was a lot more tempered, and they also weren't, right? So even Franz Rosenzweig, I'll just give an example, people, change their ideas throughout their life. There were times of Rosenzweig's life where he was willing to entertain Zionism as a pragmatic option. So he writes in some of his letters, especially after World War I, it seems like, I understand the support for it, and so he's not writing about this, idealized, oh, this is this evil entity. He's saying, hey, this doesn't seem to fit where Jews should be moving and what I think my ideal of Judaism is, but it's a lot less sort of virulent than the sort of inorganic anti-Zionism that you get today. I think I'll phrase it like that. But yeah, it's a great question. Amazing. Well, I will see you all next Monday. It was a lot of fun. Thank you all.
Thank you. Daniel, can I ask you one more question?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't mean to keep people, but
no, go for it.
You had a guest on your podcast recently who talked about the nation of Israel being Am Kodesh, like separate people or like a holy people. And I was wondering, I don't know, do you feel like that rings true to you? That kind of like Kodesh means holy, but it also means separate, and that kind of being separate is like, like anything that's holy, if you mix it with something not holy, it's no longer like, I don't know, that makes it sound like so superiorist or supremacist. But do you think about Am Kodesh as a real concept in Judaism?
I mean, it definitely is a real concept. I think it also definitely does mean separate. I think, the many translations of the Bible, ended up using this word holy, which sort of, it's sort of, not a made up, every word is made up in theory, but, the original idea of Kodesh in Judaism clearly just means something that's separated out for some unique purpose, right? So we have, Shabbat, separated out for unique purpose. The, priestly class, the Kohanim were, Kodesh, right? A Goy Kodesh is a people that were separated. Whether or not separate, clearly there have been some who have pushed this argument and said this means that Jews have to remain separated. This is more the thinking of, say, religious Zionists, right? Or Abraham Isaac Cook writes a lot about this. Most of the debates that were happening here are the sort of non-Orthodox Zionist versus anti-Zionist, right? We could have had a whole class on Orthodox Zionism versus anti-Zionism, but sadly we just didn't have enough time for that. I'll actually send a link if anybody is interested in that topic. I did another class on that a couple of months ago. And so certainly, yeah. So I don't know if that fully answers the question. Personally, I think it's a great idea. I agree with it. I think, recently, for obvious reason, I think I've found myself more on the, we need to be pragmatic side of things because, that's just, I think, where history has sort of shaped us in the last couple of years is idealism is great and we shouldn't lose it, but pragmatism has to come, whatever the Maslow hierarchy of needs is, you got to secure your own safety and well-being before you worry about, lofty ideals. And so, but despite that, I do think Israel, one of the sad parts about Israel is that because it's always in the center of so much international, demonization, many of the great things that it does, anytime people talk about it, it's just, oh, well, that's just pro-Israel propaganda. But maybe it is, but it is crazy, the amount of good that Israel's done internationally. And even, even recently in the Syrian civil war, Israel, set up field hospitals and took in tens of thousands of refugees and, helped nurse them back to health. And Israel, just a couple of weeks ago, went in and helped the Druze population who was being butchered in southern Lebanon. And, so all these cases of Israel actually trying to live out these ideals. So I think it is still a worthwhile ideal in terms of, the idea of what, Kodesh means, because the idea is also Kodesh can't exist in a vacuum, right? This is also a big Jewish idea where if you have something that's Kodesh, it can only be Kodesh in its relationship to something else, right? It can't be Kodesh in itself. And so I think that that's also a big part of, the mantra of Israel. And if anyone's curious, I put a Zoom link, a YouTube link in the chat, and this is ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism. So it's a whole other, set of ideas about why Zionism is bad, but just from a ultra-Orthodox perspective.
Sorry, one more question, Rabbi Daniel. I'm sorry to keep
no, go for it.
Questions. So is it true in Judaism that there's no such thing as doing the right thing for the wrong reason? Like if you're giving tzedakah because you feel guilty about it, it's still, you're still doing a good thing. Like I'm thinking of how you were talking about the Zionists allying with the Nazis. It's like, well, at the end of the day, you're still saving Jews, and who cares who you're allying with to do it? Is that a consistent theme in Judaism, that there's no such thing as doing the right things for wrong reasons?
Yeah, meaning nobody would tell you not to do the right thing even if you're doing it for the wrong reasons. So
Yeah.
like, yes, meaning I mean, within a reasonable spectrum, the ends justify the means in term, or sorry, the action is more important than the idea in Judaism. I mean, this is virtually, because Judaism is much more action centric. So, anybody would say that it's better to give $10 to charity, even if the whole time you're thinking like, this sucks, why am I doing this? Than somebody who says, I really wish I can give $10 to charity, but is sort of, never gets off their couch, right? Like that much is sort of obvious. And nobody would say, if you have $10 and you hate charity, don't give it to charity because you won't have the right mindset, right? It's always do the action, right? Probably it's better if you have the idea, but nobody would say don't do this if you don't have the right. There's a concept in the Talmud that if you do something for the wrong reasons, maybe you'll eventually do it for the right reasons. So that's sort of the Talmud's way to summarize this. But I mean, again, collaborating with the Nazis, maybe it's a little bit more of an extreme case, but it's very hard to blame, and again, it's not that the early Zionists, there was one project that they were working on with, Nazis, this is before the Holocaust. There also were plenty of Zionists, at the same time working to thwart the Nazis. And so, illegally smuggle people out of, Nazi controlled area and everything there. But again, the Zionists were in sort of a tough place because their biggest political adversaries early on was actually the British, who were in a war against the Nazis. So there's this famous line by Ben Gurion who essentially said, we're going to fight the Nazis as if there's no, what he called the white papers, right? This sort of, British not letting Zionism actually help Jews immigrate. So we're going to fight the white papers as if there's no Nazis, and we're going to fight the Nazis as if there's no white papers. Because, they were really, there was all these different dynamics happening at the same time. So, it was quite the complicated picture there as well.
Very nice. There's a very nice discussion on this, doing the right thing for the wrong reason and growing into doing the right thing for the right reason in Pirkei Avot, and who quotes Maimonides, that you can start out for the wrong reason, but you're still doing something good. And eventually, as you get more mature, you're going to start, hopefully, doing the right thing for the right reason.
Yeah,
But
100%.
yes.
Amazing. Well, thank you all. I will see you all next Monday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you again.